Hi, this is Robin, and today's video is going to be about basic photorealistic compositing in Photoshop. So the principles that I'm going to cover in this video workshop can be used to make composites in which you want to achieve a photorealistic look. And it won't matter whether you're going to be doing fine art photography or product photography, wedding or lifestyle or family photography. So really the principles that I'm going to cover are going to, you could really use them in any of those different types of compositing. In a number of my videos, what I've done is I usually start with some concepts or definitions or both, and then I move into the demo part of the video. So I'm going to do the same thing here just to set the stage for some important things to either think about or understand before you start diving right into making composites and trying to do your own composites. So let me start with the definitions. I think that there are roughly three different types of composites that we can make in Photoshop. So the first is photorealistic, which is what's going to be the focus of this video. And in a photorealistic composite, they are made from multiple piece parts or different elements, whether they're objects or subjects and people, that when assembled, they form a unified, logical, realistic looking scene. It almost looks like it could come out of a camera for whatever genre that you're creating. So if you're doing a real life scene, if you're doing a fantasy or something sort of surreal, if you're doing a sci-fi, in all of those cases, what you're creating with a photorealistic composite should look like it could actually exist no matter what the genre that you're creating. And as I said, that's what I'm going to work with as from a basics level in this video, is how to make a basic photorealistic composite in Photoshop. The second type of composite that I think there is called a collage. And a collage is also made from multiple separate elements that, when put together, should be well composed. But unlike the photorealistic composite, a collage will still look like separate piece parts. It looks like cut out pieces that perhaps you would put into a scrapbook, or they could have a mixed media kind of a look, so they don't all come together and look like a uniform whole. It's a nicely composed piece, but you still see and are very much aware of the individual piece parts in a collage. And then the final type of composite that I'm going to, that I think is available to you, is a faux double exposure or a fake double exposure. So again, multiple elements in a faux double exposure are overlaid on each other in Photoshop to give the same kind of effect you might get by capturing double exposures in camera, whether it's a digital camera or the old film cameras. And I'm not going to cover that today, so I will cover how to make a faux double exposure in another video at another time. You've probably seen these, so like you might have a silhouette of a person's head with a landscape inside it or something like that. They seem to be very popular right now. So anyway, I will cover ways to make in different styles of faux double exposures in another video. So those are the three different types of composites that I think of and am aware of, but as I said, this video will focus on photorealistic. Now, there are some principles to keep in mind when you're making photorealistic composites that are very important to keep in your mind and be conscious of as you're constructing it. Details are very, very important. They can make or break a photorealistic composite. So the kinds of things that you need to keep in mind and make sure you're doing include make sure that the elements that you put into the scene, because as I said, you're putting miscellaneous piece parts into a background or a unified scene. So make sure all of the elements are proportionally balanced to each other and to the scene you're putting them into, and make sure that they are all in proper perspective to each other and to the background that you put them into. It's important to match the colors of the objects that you put into your scene. So if you have a very cool object and you put it into a warm scene, it's not going to fit and it's not going to look right and it'll stand out. And that's not good if you're going for photorealistic, and vice versa. If you put a warm object into a cool scene, it's just not going to look right. It's going to stand out. So you need to be able to match colors when you put elements into a composite. You need to be very aware of and be able to adjust the direction and the quality of light in the scene. So if the light in your background scene, for instance, is coming from upper right and heading down towards lower left, and on your objects it's coming from left and heading straight across towards the right, well, that's not going to match the background. So you need to be able to adjust the direction of light. You need to be able to adjust the quality of light. So if it's a soft, hazy background, you don't want to put something into the scene that has a very harsh, hard light on it. So you need to match those things. You also need to be able to match the angle of view of any objects that you put into your scene to the background. So for instance, if you're looking straight on at your background scene, well then you don't want to put objects in that you're looking at from an aerial or a bird's eye view or from a ground level, or as I call it, a worm's eye view, because they just won't match the angle of view of the background. So be conscious of making sure that all your piece parts are shot from the same angle, and or that you can adjust them to look like they're from the same angle. You also have to look at the quality, the color, and the direction of shadows in your scene. So if your background scene has shadows that are heading towards the left, that means your light source is to the right. And so anything you put into the scene, you're going to have to match the shadows to other shadows in the scene. You also have to look, as I said, at the quality of the shadows. So if it's midday and they're very hard-edged shadows, well then you don't want to put soft-edged shadows into the scene, or again, vice versa. So you have to match the color, the quality, and the direction of the shadows to the background scene for a composite, for a photorealistic composite. And it is important to put shadows on your objects that you put into your scene for a photorealistic composite, because you need to plant those objects into the scene. You're not going to sell the realism of the scene if they're just sitting there looking like cutouts. If they end up looking like cutouts, then you've gone over into that collage category of composite and you're no longer in photorealistic. You also need to mimic the clarity of all the elements in the scene. So if your background shot or background plate is a little on the soft side, well then don't include very sharp-edged or contrasty elements into the scene, or again, vice versa. So be conscious of the quality of the elements in the scene, and if the background scene objects are slightly soft, then slightly soften the elements that you're going to composite into that scene. And then two other things to think about, this at least, but as I said, details are important. Check to be sure that any needed reflections are put into your composite. So if you're adding, let's say, a tree or a person or something near a lake, in a scene with a lake, or a reflective type of water puddle, be sure you bring the reflection down into that puddle. If you're doing a product type of shoot for compositing, and you put an object onto a shiny surface, whether it's a table or whatever, then be sure that the object you're compositing in has an appropriate matching kind of reflection on that shiny surface. It doesn't just have to be water. So think about where it would make sense for there to be reflections. In the video I'm doing today, there will be no need for a reflection, so I'll make another video at another time that will cover how to create reflections when you're doing compositing. And then the final thing to make sure of that I want to mention, at least for this video, is don't over repeat patterns. So for instance, if you're using an overlay or another photo of yours, whatever, to put in a flock of birds or trees or rocks or anything, don't just keep using that same element over and over and over in your scene, because people's eyes will pick up on it and they'll know that something is off. So if you are going to use an overlay or something to add that kind of element to your scene, just be sure that you modify it in some way so that you break up the patterns and people's eyes won't get hung up in something just seems off in the scene. So don't over repeat patterns that could throw off your viewers. Another thing to keep in mind is when you're doing compositing, you are going to need some key basic Photoshop skills. So I'd say the skills that are going to be most important if you're just starting out compositing would be being able to make and refine selections, to be able to remove distractions from your scene, to be able to make tonal adjustments and color adjustments as you're compositing. And I'm not going to get into all the details of all those things in this particular video. This is strictly about how to put the composite together from a basic level. But I do have other videos in my @Photomaker Academy channel. So if you just look at some of my other videos, I've covered those topics in depth. My voice is going, so I'm going to stop for a quick drink of water here. Okay. So here we go. So in this video, as I said, I'm going to cover how to create a simple composite starting with a background, and this is my background here that I'm going to use, and this is the background plate. And then I'm going to add a single object to this just to keep it simple and to keep the time down that we spend on the video. But you can certainly add multiple elements to whatever scene you want to work with as your background. It doesn't matter if you're using a landscape or an interior like I am, whether it's a still life or a group portrait, whatever. So let's say you were taking a picture of a group of people and one of them didn't make it to the shoot. You can take a picture of that other person and composite them into the group using some of these same kinds of principles. So all you'd have to do is, since I'm only going to do one object into the scene, just keep repeating the steps that I'm going to demo for each element that you want to add. And I guess the only other proviso I'd say is definitely take more time than I will in this demo. I'm not going to be perfectionist about this because I just want to show you the tools and the principles, and you can spend a lot more time for your own actual composite. Depending on how in-depth or how complex a composite I'm doing, if it's going to be more complex than this with a lot of different elements, I usually make a sketch first and decide what do I want in the composite, and then I create a shoot list and I go out and I shoot the various elements that I want to put into the scene to match the background. And then I also, if I can't shoot them all, then I know what I need to get from stock sites like Adobe or whatever, Pexels, things like that. So definitely I would spend generally 2 to 3 days making mine. People who make even more complex composites can take up to a year or more sometimes. So anyway, just spend more time is the bottom line. Okay, so this is the background plate I'm going to be working with, and here were some options that I pulled from stock photography as a potential item that I might want to put into this scene. So let's just look at them and then I'll explain my rationale and logic for what I think would make the most sense here. So first of all, this is a very warm background, so that's something I need to think about as I'm going to be compositing my images in here also. But the first thing I want to think about is even more basic, and I said, remember, look at the angle of view. So you can see that this was shot pretty much at an eye level view looking down at this table and this scene. So I need to composite in something that was shot at roughly the same angle of view, because otherwise it's going to be virtually impossible for me to adjust it. I'm not working with CAD CAM or something three-dimensional where you can rotate it around. I'm working with 2D images. So let's look at each of these options and see what we think, whether they'll fit or not. So this first one with the grape tomatoes, now honestly I don't know if it's really the best thing for this kind of scene, which looks kind of rustic and yet formal, whatever. But the trouble is, as I said, this was shot at an eye level view looking down. This looks like it was shot at a much higher angle, almost an aerial angle looking down at this. So I'm not going to be able to get this angle of object to look right in this scene. So I'm just going to close this and eliminate this as an option. So we have two more options that I pulled from stock photography here. The next one is these cherries, and I really like the idea of them because, again, sort of the colors, the sort of like pewter looking bowl look like they would fit really nicely into this, the sort of the gestalt, as you want to say it, of this scene. But the trouble is, this one looks like the person who shot this had this, they were down at the level looking straight on at this bowl of cherries. And again, this is not straight on. This is looking slightly down. I can't tell because I'm at an angle over here looking down, but it was shot from like an eye view looking down. This was shot straight on. So there's no way I'm going to get this to look right in this picture. So again, with this one, I'm going to get rid of that. Okay, and then we have this one, and let me make it a little bigger here. Okay, so let's look at this one and see if this is going to work. So for this one, we have the vase with the flowers. And again, I think it would fit this kind of a scene and the look of this kind of a scene. And looking down at this table, it sort of looks like the angle that this was shot might be a little bit lower than this background plate was shot, but it's close enough that I think this is going to work. So I'm going to work with this vase for this scene and try to composite this into this image. So before I start to work with any images, what I always do is duplicate my background layer because I don't want to do anything to damage my background layer. So I am going to, there's two different ways you can do this. So you can either take this background layer and drag it down to the add new layer icon, or you can do a Control or Command J with that active and just jump it up there. It was what the J stands for, to create a duplicate layer. One more thing I'm going to do for you here, because I've done it in my other videos, but might as well do it in here too in case you haven't seen them. So I've customized my Photoshop workspace from what it typically looks like for a lot of people. So I just want to okay, that's great. Give you a quick tour of the layout. So if you're in your system and it looks different than what I'm using, you know where to find things. So this is my toolbar right here. Yours might be docked over on the left. My layers panel is right here at the top. So all my layers and masks will be up at the top here. And my properties panel is down at the bottom. So any of the settings for any of the tools or adjustment layers or whatever that I'm working with will be appearing down here. Okay, so we've got my background layer duplicated. We've got a selection of the object that I want to move into my scene. What I prefer to do is select the objects and then move them into my scene. Some people will copy over the entire image and then start removing the background or doing things like that. If you're working with a really tricky selection, you might want to do that second thing and drag the whole thing over, because then if you miss parts of it, it's the full image is there and you can recover some of them. But I'm just going to make a selection. So to do that, I'm going to my object selection tool, which is this little arrow into this box here, going up to my options bar, and I'm going to click on select subject, and I'm going to let Photoshop process. You can see it in my yellow cursor there. Okay, and Photoshop has made a selection, and I'm not dwelling on this or how it's doing it because, again, as I said, I've created a video in depth on how to create, modify, and refine selections. So I'm just going to do this and move on, and if it's not perfect, we're not going to worry about it for purposes of the demo here. Okay, so I'm going to grab this object. Oops. And I'm going to move it with my move tool active over into this scene here. Okay. Now, so we've got this into the scene and it's on its own empty layer. So let me just hide my background layer for a moment. So the selected object is on its own empty layer. Empty meaning this is all these little gray boxes are transparency. So that transparency means that you can see wherever the gray is down below to the layers below this object. So if I turn this back on, you can see it's almost like if you're old enough to remember overhead projectors, the transparency slides that you can put a whole stack of them in there, and the content on each one gets overlaid over all the ones below it, and that's how this works too. As you build up, that's how you build up your layers. Okay, so I can move with my move tool still active. I can move this and position it around to different places in the scene, and you can see because it's on top, on the top layer there, if I move it over here, it's going to block what's below it, and that's just how it works. So depending on where you want to put this. So I'm going to start with it here, and I think it seems a little small for my scene, so I want to scale this up a little bit larger. Now, what I also want you to notice is, because one of the things I said to do was to match the perspective and the angle of view and things like that. So if we look at the original image, just let's look for a moment, since it was shot at roughly the kind of angle that I wanted for my composite, look at where this table line falls relative to the vase. So it's kind of just, above the bottom of the handle on the vase. So that, and the vase is placed very close to the edge of that table in this scene. So I'm going to use that as a point of reference when I'm over here, so that relative to this vase, this shadow here is pretty much in the same position as the back of this table to the vase. So if I move this up here, I'm going to try to line up so that the bottom, near the bottom of the handle, is pretty much in the same position with that shadow as where this is hitting here, so that we have it proportionally accurate, okay, and the right angle of view for this scene. The next thing I want to do is, because this looks a little on the small side to me, I want to enlarge it. So before I start playing with that, what I want to do is label this as my vase, and this is the original layer, okay? And again, since I don't want to have to keep doing this over and over in case something gets goofed up, I'm going to duplicate this by dragging it down to the new layer icon, the square with the plus, and make a duplicate, and I'm just going to turn off the visibility so I protect this layer. Okay, so now we have a copy of the vase. There's nothing different about it. When we want to scale up or enlarge or shrink down objects in a scene in Photoshop, what you should do, and this gets a little trickier, but we're going to do it, is convert that object to a smart object. If you just start enlarging and minimizing the size of an object, what happens is every time you make it bigger and smaller, you're losing pixels and resolution for your object, and you'll lose the quality of the object that you're compositing into your scene. So you never want to do that. In order to protect the resolution of your original image, what we want to do is convert this layer to a smart object to do the scaling. And the way we do that is we go on the layers panel. So again, yours might be down at the bottom. go to this little hamburger menu and click in there, or you can right click in here. And we come down to where it says convert to smart object. See that right there? And I'm going to left click on convert to smart object. And what you can see is now this little icon has appeared. So before, this layer looked like this layer, and now there's this little icon here. That tells you that it's a smart object. So now what we've done by doing that as a smart object is essentially put this object into an envelope that'll let you manipulate it in different ways, and it will protect the resolution. Okay, so in order to scale this up, what I'm going to do is go over to Edit, Transform, so come down to Transform, and come over here to where it says Scale. Okay, now you could also work with Free Transform if you like, but I just tend to like to work with the words that are here. Free Transform will give you all of these things just in one tool. Okay, so I'm going to click on Scale. And now we have these handles and these cross pieces. So because I kept the legacy approach to scaling, I'm pressing my Shift key and positioning my cursor over one of the corner handles, and I'm going to pull up diagonally. And that's actually pretty good there. I like the look of that. Okay, and I say I'm using the let's move this down there just a little bit. Yeah, using the legacy approach because I think in the newer versions of Photoshop, by default, you don't have to press Shift anymore. You can just pull these handles and it will maintain the correct aspect ratio of your image. In the older systems, you had to press Shift and pull to maintain the aspect ratio. And if you have a preference one way or other, if you prefer not to have to hold Shift, then you can set that in your edit preferences. That's one of the preferences that you can set. Okay, so I am happy with where I've scaled this to. So now I'm going to click on the check mark to accept that, and I am going to take this off of move just so that I don't see those red bars there anymore. And because I've got this the way I like it, now I'm going to rasterize this again and not keep this as a smart object, because certain functions in Photoshop will not work if you have a layer set as a smart object. So again, I'm going to right click on that layer, and we're going to come down to where it says rasterize layer, and that's all we need to do to turn off that smart object. So you can see that little icon is gone, and I'm going to label this as vase resized. Okay, and accept that. And I think maybe just again for safety's sake, let me, as we don't have to go through the whole process again, duplicate that again, and then I'll turn off the visibility to this one just so we have a backup in case we need it. All right. So that's that. So that's how the initial steps for selecting and getting your object or your person into your scene. Those are the steps that you would follow to get it into the scene, and the kinds of considerations you need to think about to get it positioned, scaled, and into your scene. Now, the next thing that I had said to pay attention to when you're compositing is to look at and match the color of the composited in object or subject to the background. And as we can see, this background plate is very warm colors, whereas this image is very cool, very blue toned. And so it's not matching right now. It just stands out like a sore thumb. So we need to match the color of this to the background and make this cooler object warmer to match the scene. So there's two two different methods that, or at least two. In Photoshop, there's always tons of methods, but that I'll show you. So I am working in Photoshop 2023. If you're working in an older version of Photoshop, you may have to be only able to use this more classic approach of matching color in Photoshop. So I'll show that first, okay? So the approach here is to, with this layer active, so you can see it's active because we have the blue highlight there, we want to go to Image, which is up here in the menu. So the Image menu, come down to Adjustments, and then pull over. See the little right arrow that's showing, so shows there's more options, and then pull all the way down to where it says Match Color, and you're going to left click on that, and we get this pop-up box for matching the color of the object to another scene or another object. Okay. By the way, your image that you're working with needs to be in RGB mode in order for match color to work. So you can check image mode and be sure, if it's not working, to be sure that you're on RGB. Okay, so that's important to be aware of. All right, what I do is I keep a check mark on for preview so I can see what's happening. And because we have the element that we're color matching already in the layer stack, we don't need to do some of the other settings that normally would be done. But I'm going to set the source here and see if it helps to set the source as the background plate, which is my background scene here. Okay. The other thing is I think I'm going to want to probably hit neutralize for this, because there's this blue color cast to this, and neutralize will take off any color casts that are in the scene that you're working with. So for instance, if you used a neutral density filter to shoot, or if there's something like this, or some other kind of filter, a polarizer or something, it might give a color cast. So let's just see what clicking on neutralize does. Yeah, see, so that helped a lot. Let me watch the vase and not where I'm clicking neutralize in this pop-up box. Okay, so watch the vase and I'm going to click on neutralize, and you can see it's already helped somewhat because it's taken away that bluer look. It's given it a bit of a magenta look, but it has warmed it up. So next I'm going to work with my image options here and see if we can try to color match this a little bit better to the scene. So the first slider that we have to work with is luminance, and that adjusts the brightness of the object that we're working with. It goes all the way up to 200, but I don't think we're going to need anything like that. So let's just, there's no magic numbers for anything in Photoshop. Everything is trial and error. So even though I've been working with it for a while, everybody just has to experiment till you find the look you like. So let's just start sliding this and seeing. Okay, so because this is sitting in a shadowed part of the tablecloth here, I'm trying to get not only the warmer color, but also make it look more suitably bright for where it's sitting in a shadowed part of the scene. So let me move this around a bit. I don't totally want to lose all the brightness, but we try. I don't know, let me try 50 and see. That's a little more than I wanted. Yeah, all right, so I'm going to leave that, the luminance at 50. Next is the color intensity, and the color intensity will adjust the the saturation, sorry, of the colors in the scene. So again, this one also goes up to 200. So let me see where I want to be with this. I don't want it too saturated. All right, let me see here. Yeah, that's actually pretty good there. All right, so let me just go up a little and see. Oops, didn't grab it. You know, so that's too saturated for the scene. So again, because it's in a dark room, I'm going to leave that right around there. And then what the fade slider does is it's the amount of the adjustment that you want to make. So as you pull it towards the right, it will reduce the effect of what we're applying here. So let's just see where I want to go with this. And I just watched the object I'm adjusting to see what it does. Yeah, so that's getting, so if you go all the way, it's already back to where you started from. So I'm going to leave that right about there. And when you get it the way you like it, so again, I'm not going to spend too much time because you're not going to be working with this image anyway, but just to give you the sense that luminance will adjust your brightness and just slide the slider back and forth till you find where it looks right for your image. The color intensity will adjust the saturation, and the fade will determine how much of these two adjustments get applied, so you can go all the way back to your starting point if you want to. Okay, and then when you're ready, just hit OK. All right, and now we've applied it, and let me just make another duplicate of this here just so we have that. And so now what we have is, we're going to relabel this. This is color match vase. So this is approach number 1, and that was using the color match approach. Okay. And we can see, hopefully, if I turn this eye on and off, oops, turn this on and off, you'll see that it has made an adjustment relative to the scene. Okay, so it's not as cool as it was here. All right, so now the next approach I'm going to show you is if you have a newer version. So let me turn this off and go back to this layer here as our launching layer. If you have a newer version of Photoshop, then you will have neural filters in the filter menu. Filter, neural filters, right there. And in the neural filters is something called harmonization. So again, I want to select the layers. We're not going to work with the one we just processed because that's already harmonized using color match. So we're going to go back to the cool one again here, and you don't need to do both of these unless you want to experiment and see which you get the better result with. So just pick one or the other of these approaches. So with this layer active, I go up to the filter menu, come down to neural filters, and I think the neural filters maybe were first introduced in 2021, but I can't remember if this particular neural filter only came in with Photoshop 2022, so you'll just have to look on your system and click on neural filters, and then you'll get the list of the neural filters that are available at the time. And the one I want you to come down to is under the color category. And again, if you have an earlier version of Photoshop, it might not be divided into these categories. And look for harmonization. And you'll see that it is still in a beta mode. So that means they're still tweaking it, and there might be fluky things that happen with it. But anyway, it's still usable in this beta mode. So what I'm going to do is click this little switch to on, and that opens the harmonization panel. Okay. And what we want to do in this approach is select the layer, so come down here, that we want to have this object harmonized to. So what's going to be the color reference layer is another way of saying that. So we want that object matched to the color of one of our background layers. So I'm just going to pick this here. Okay. So you can see this is going to become the color reference for this. And now, after we do that, the Photoshop will process it very quickly, and then we can adjust the strength of this. So let's see. Yeah. So what you can see is that you can see the processing if you look down here somewhere, and because I have a pretty fast computer, it goes so fast you don't see it happening. So well, let me just pull it up again and see if it does it there. Did you see that? So the harmonization has already been processed for this. So again, this is like what we just saw a moment ago for the fade slider in color match. This strength slider lets you say how much of the effect of the harmonization do you want. And I'm going to keep it. I'm looking at the tablecloth, and since they're pretty similar colors, I don't want this too yellow. I'm going to try to go relative to the tablecloth. So that looks pretty good to me. I might add a hint of yellow. So again, if there's more color content in some of the things that you are working with, you might want to adjust it to more red or cyan or more magenta or green, or if there's still too much green, move it towards magenta. If there's still too much cyan in your image, move it towards red. So you can adjust these things. I don't think I need to adjust the saturation of this, but maybe I'll just do a little bit just for kicks. And then the brightness, I can take the brightness down because again, this is in the shadow area. So let's see what happens if I start. There we go. You can see it's, watch again the vase. As I lower the brightness, it's better to watch what's happening to the image than watch me slide, because the numbers aren't going to do you any good because you're going to be working with different images. So you just have to get the brightness level to a place where you feel comfortable with it. And I just do things gradually. Okay, and actually maybe I'll just do it a lot more and see. Yeah, all right, so then now I went past the point because I want to keep some brightness there. All right, so I feel pretty good with that. And you don't need to fill this out, but if you want to tell Adobe, if you're satisfied with how the results came out, to help them refine this, since it is in a beta mode, and especially if it doesn't work well, then you might want to click on one or the other of these and then explain to them what you liked or didn't like. But I don't typically do that at this point, okay? The thing I do is come down to where it says output, because this is where what you've just accomplished is going to be placed. And I don't like to overwrite my current layer, so I come to this little down arrow and I select new layer. And I want the result of this process to be sent to a new layer. So once you get this as you like it, you can click new layer. If you don't like how it turned out or you think you goofed, you can hit this little symbol here and it'll just reset it and you can start over again, okay? And something else to mention, I guess, while I'm still here. The way that harmonization works is where you've placed your composited in an image, it's going to harmonize from the colors that are adjacent to, strictly, that's the word I was trying to say, not slowly, strictly adjacent to that object. So if you think it comes out, let's say, too yellow or too blue or whatever, and you want it to look more like maybe the colors in another area of your image, before you come into this interface, while you're still back on your Photoshop layer, take your move tool and just slide that object over to the area of color that you like better. Run this harmonization, go back to the layer stack, and then take your move tool and put it back where you wanted it, because that way you can sort of control what colors are being grabbed. So that's just a little advanced thing beyond the basics here. Okay, I'm going to hit OK, and it is going to hopefully take me back. Okay, and we have here a new layer, and it's created a new layer. So I'm going to turn this off because I've got the new layer here. And we're going to say that this was the neural harmonize vase. Okay, so this was the second approach we did. All right, so now let me turn this on so we can see the differences. All right, so here's what we started with this sort of very bright, cool blue thing. Here's what we get using the neural filter harmonize option. And here's what we got using color match. Okay, from under the image menu. So you can decide which you like better. I'm going to work with the one from the neural filter just because I'm familiar with it. So what I'm going to do is just drag this down below here and put that on top. All right, so all of this is hidden at this point, and now we have the neural filter that is color matching in on this layer. All right, so as I told you that this is not an easy process, and it's not a fast process to create composites. So if you're not patient, maybe compositing isn't a good thing to do. One last thing to mention with regard to the neural filters that I just used here is that neural filters must be downloaded in order to use them. They're not just automatically on in your Photoshop system for the newer versions of Photoshop, newer releases of Photoshop. So just be conscious if you don't see them, just click on the little icons to download them. And neural filters will be supported on Windows 10 and later. And I'm not a Mac user, I'm a Windows user, but I believe from what I've read that for the Mac OS, starting with the 10.15, neural filters should be supported on them. So just something to be aware of if you would like to use the neural filters. Okay, so the next thing of the different principles and considerations I said up front for when you're making composites after color matching is to match the direction of light of the composited in object to the subject. Now, ideally, you'd go out and create your own shots for things that you want to composite into a scene, because then you can control the direction of the light and say, hey, I know I'm going to use this background. Let me shoot different things that I know will fit that and make sure the light's coming from the proper direction, make sure it's either a warm or cool background. You know, you can match all that stuff as you're shooting it, and it will save you the time of doing all of this kind of stuff in Photoshop. But if you use stock photography or older photos of yours that weren't initially intended to be used in a composite, then you have to do these kinds of things that I'm showing you here. So the next thing I'm going to think about is matching the light direction. So let me just add an empty layer here for a moment and click on my brush tool and click on something that's easy to see. And the direction of light in this background scene is coming from this direction here. You can see the light is coming from here and it's casting shadows, long shadows, so it must be fairly low in the sky here that it's doing that, okay? And if we look at this object that I've just composited in here, you can see, and even though I darkened it up, you can still see elements of it. The light was clearly coming from this direction and hitting on this side. You can see that all along. So that's a mismatch because we have to have the light coming from this side to match the background, okay? So now I'm going to delete this because this was just to help you see what we're doing. I'm going to reset this here. Okay, so what I want to do first is to get this to match the direction of light in the background. And the way I'm going to do that is with that already color matched layer active, I'm going to come over to Edit, which is up here at the top of the interface, come down to Transform again, so right here, and then using that flyout menu, come down to where it says Flip Horizontal. So again, we're in Edit, Transform, Flip Horizontal, and when I click on it, hopefully that vase will fly around and switch around the opposite direction. There we go. So now we've got the light hitting it from this direction just by a simple little change that way. Okay, and if you're doing something, here, let me just show you this for a moment. I don't particularly want it there, but let me just move this here. So clearly that's not realistic. If this, let me zoom in so you can see, is floating in front of that chair because the chair is in the foreground. So if you have an object, so let's say you were putting a person in with a group of people and you sort of want to tuck them behind other people that are already in the group scene and that person just was left out that day, if you move them over so that they're overlapping a little bit, and then you add a mask to this layer. So you come down to the bottom of your layers panel to this little rectangle with the circle on it, and left click on that. It will add a mask to that layer. Your mask is active. You can see that because there's a white frame around it. To hide these foreground objects so that this looks like it's where it should be position wise, you would come down in your toolbar to the brush tool. Looks like a paintbrush. Left click on that, and in Photoshop, to reveal something or show something, it should be white. To hide something, you use black. So you make sure that black is your foreground color in your color picker, and with your mask active, you come over, and so the yellow is just a little highlighter for you to see. The white circle in the center there is actually my brush size, so I'm going to enlarge my brush just a little bit so you can see where it is. Okay, and you would just paint away where that chair is. So again, like let's say you were tucking a person behind a row of people, and they'd stand out too much and be really too hard to mix them probably, if depending on what it is. But maybe you didn't want to put them in front of the other people. But in any case, if you want to put some people behind the one you're compositing in, or put the one you're compositing in behind others, that's how you can tuck them in so that it's not just obvious and they don't just look like a cutout or look like a strange person standing out to the side. Everybody else would probably be pretty close to each other, and this is a way you could do something like that. All right, so let me come back out now that I've shown you that, and I'm going to actually remove this because it'll make it easier to show you some of the other things. All right, so we've got that. We got the move tool. We're going to move him back over in this general area here. Okay. All right. So we've done that. So take this off. Now the next thing to look at is I already darkened this down a bit when we were doing the color matching, but I think it still is a little bright given that this is on the opposite side from where the light direction is coming. So let me enlarge this up. So what I want to do in the case like this, and you might want to do it in yours, is paint in a little bit more shadow on the vase itself, and on the parts of, in my case, the flower, where the light would be blocked by some of these things, so you wouldn't have bright light in these hidden areas. So again, to get that photorealism look. To paint on this, what I'm going to do is add an empty layer. So don't paint directly onto this, because if you goof or you change your mind, then you have to start all over again. So what I do is, as I said, create new layers for everything you're doing. It doesn't matter how many layers, there's no limits. And then if you want to change something, it's easier to do it. So come down to the bottom of your layers panel, click on the add layer icon, which is the box with the plus in it, and we've got a new layer here. And what I'm going to label this to be is paint shadow on vase. Okay. To do that, let's come back down to the brush tool. And what I want to do is use a soft brush. So come up to your options bar, which is up here across the top for the brush tool. Every tool has different options associated with it, and you can find them up at the top. So let's come down over here to the brush, type of brush, click that little down arrow, and I'm using a soft brush at a soft setting, so that's good. That's what I want to be using. And I don't want this at full opacity, otherwise I'd completely block whatever it is that I'm using here. So I want to lower the opacity of my brush and the strength with which I'm painting. So let me get this to, and again, as I said, everything is trial and error. There's no magic number, so maybe I'll do between 50 and 60%. Can you see it's changing the opacity as I'm doing this? All right. And I'm also going to lower the flow. What lowering the flow does is lets you paint multiple times so you can gradually build up. So it's better to start with less and build more, whereas if you have it on 100% flow, you're just going to get the full strength the whole time. So I'm going to, when I'm retouching things like skin or stuff like that, I always go to a flow of 12% or more. So I'm going to start this at around 11 or 12% and see. There we go. Let me just leave that there for now till I see if that's going to work. And because I really only want it to apply to the highlights, I'm also going to change the brush blend mode to luminosity. And we're going to set these all back when I get done, but this is just what I'm first going to try here and see if this is going to work with this or how this is going to work. Okay, now you never just paint with black. There's no such thing as a fully black shadow, and I want it to match what I'm going to be painting on, which is the side away from the light for the vase. So what I want to do is sample a shadow color that's already in the vase so that it matches. With your brush tool active, you can save a step. You don't need to go up to the eyedropper tool. I'm going to press and hold Alt. If you're on a Mac, you can press and hold, I believe, Option. And so you can watch this. So now it's the brush tool. Watch, see the little circle? That's a brush tip. If I press and hold Alt, it changes to the eyedropper. So I can sample the shadow color. I just left click once there and release. And now you can see it's changed my foreground color to the color that I sampled. So now we can try and experiment and see with these different option settings, a moderate opacity, a low flow, and with luminosity, if when I paint in here, if it is adding some more shadow on the darker side, the side away from the light. So really what I only want to keep lighter is this area up in here that might be getting some bounce because all of this is in shadow. And I'm not going to worry about if I go over the lines, to be honest, because as I said, you have to be careful in your own thing when you're working on your own project because you want it to be good and you want it to be correct, but I'm just trying to demonstrate the principles here. So let's just do a quick check here. I'm going to turn the visibility for this layer where I'm painting off by turning off that eye for a second. Yeah, so you can see I've darkened up the shadows here on this side away from the light. And again, I'm not going to worry about being perfect just for purposes of demo here. But I'm going to zoom in closer so that for this narrower part, see, because this is all blocking it, so the light wouldn't be hitting. It might be hitting some of this, but the flow is very low, so I'm just going to paint with the shadow over this area because it should be dark. And if you have a pattern like this, you may not want to paint over it too much, or you might want to reduce it a little bit. But I'm not worrying about that right now. Okay, you can see, and again, I've gone over the lines, but in my selections video, I cover an area where if it tells you how if you make a selection you can paint more easily inside lines, so you might want to check out that video too. But let's just turn this on and off again for a check. Yeah, so we've gotten this to where it is darkening it down. Now I also can, in the layer stack, see where I am in the layer on the right side of the layer stack, there's an opacity setting here too. And once you get it all painted on, if it looks a little bit extreme, you can lower your opacity to taste too, just so that you don't lose any details. And I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to call that good for purposes of painting on the shadows onto the vase. Now I'm going to do the same thing separately in the flowers, because again, do each thing separately, and then if you change your mind later, you can always turn it off and make it not visible. So again, come down to the bottom of the layers panel, add a new layer with the square with the plus, and this one is going to be paint shadow on foliage. Okay, and again, if I change my mind by doing it this way, I can, and I'm just pressing shift and then moving my image around so that we can position it more here. Okay, so again, I'm going to use my brush tool. For now, I'm going to leave it on these settings. I'm going to press and hold Alt. If you're on a Mac, try Option. And I'm going to sample a color that's on a backside, see, away from the source of light for the shadow for the plants. Okay, and we've got a dark green in our foreground color on the toolbar now. And then I'm just going to, where it shouldn't be showing, so on the backs of some of these, start painting again. And this is behind leaves, so we shouldn't be seeing a lot of bright light in here. And even though this is a blue, I'm just going to paint with the green on here for now for expediency's sake. So again, paint with whatever colors and keep sampling and painting with the appropriate colors for your image. Let me just turn this on and off and be sure. Yeah, you can see that it's, and this is why I like to keep it on low flow, because you can control it. But I'm leaving the brightness here because see, this is up where the light would hit it. This would not here be getting that light. And I'm not going to be, again, too perfectionist about this. Let me make my brush a little bigger, just so we can keep moving here. This definitely would not be getting the light over under this leaf because it would be blocked. The back of this side of this flower wouldn't. This over here is behind. So again, you just have to kind of think and logically, and again, you would have, I can see some white fringing on this. So again, right up front, you would have had to refine the selection a bit too, but I mentioned how to refine selections in another video. So let's just, you don't need to watch grass grow here. So I'm going to say this is good enough to create a more realistic shadow effect, and again, just slightly reduce the opacity in my layers panel. But at this point now, we do have the shadows, and I'm not going to take the time to do it, but you can do the reverse process too. So you could create another layer and then sample, and if these don't look quite bright enough to suit where the light is coming from, then you could sample again a bright part. I'm just going to do it quick, even though I wouldn't normally do it, and paint some brightness on where it would be more appropriate to be brighter onto things too. Okay, so you can do the inverse. You can paint the shadows in and you can paint some more highlights in using the same kind of process. All right, so I am going to reset this to black and white before I leave my brush tool. I do the same thing I do with my camera, which is just sort of put it back to a neutral position setting that I always keep it on, so I know where it is when I go to use the tool and don't start freaking myself out. So I put these back, opacity's back to 100%, this is back on normal. Okay, and I just don't stay there. All right, so we have matched our direction of light in this object now too, so that's good. So we've done color matching and matching the direction of light. Not only does it match the direction of light, but again, when you're working with 2D pictures, you can also add some dimension and three-dimensionality to your objects if you paint in some of these shadows and highlights. It just gives it a more dimensional type of an aspect, which adds to the photorealism. Okay, so now the next thing that we want to do is to add a ground shadow, because as I said, right now it's just sort of looking like it's floating there, which would be perfectly fine for a collage, but for a photorealistic composite, we need to plant this vase into the scene, and there's clearly shadows here, so it needs a similar type of shadow. We need to ground this to help sell the photorealistic composite. So what we need to do is make the layer active that has the composited object or person. Okay, and so let me go back here, and I'm just going to for a moment turn these off, and I'm going to work with this, and let me see if this will work. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so you make your layer, because these are empty layers, so we can't work with this. We have to work with the layer that has our vase or our object on it. And with that layer active, you can tell it's active because I've got the color on the layer. What we want to do is create a new layer below it to hold the shadow. Okay, so in order to create that new layer below it, the way I usually do it, and you could try it and see how it works for you, is I press and hold Control. So again, if you're on a Mac, I think that's Command, and then while it's still pressed Control or Command is pressed down, I come down to the bottom of the layers panel to the new layer icon, which is the square with the plus, and left click on that, and you can see we've created a new layer underneath here. So I'm going to label that vase table shadow, if I can spell shadow right. There we go. So this is the one that's going to match like these other shadows on the tablecloth. That's going to come along the bottom that way. Okay. Now, again, we need to sample a color. So what we're going to do here is using our eyedropper this time, because we're not going to paint. So come to your toolbar and down to the eyedropper. It looks like a little eyedropper right there. And I'm going to zoom in. And as I said before, there's no such thing as a black shadow. And they all have color, they all have different qualities of darkness or lightness or softness or hardness. So I'm going to look for, since these are pretty dark shadows, a dark place in the shadows that I can sample a shadow color from. And this is pretty dark here, so I'm going to select in there. Using my eyedropper, I just left clicked, and you can see in my color picker it has added that color to the foreground color for the color picker. So I'm going to zoom out again, because all we needed to do was to get that color and see where that was. All right, now the next thing we have to do is make sure we're on that shadow layer, the layer below the object. We are, and that's active. And we've sampled the color that we want to do, and now what we want to do is fill this layer with the selected object using that foreground color. So what I'm going to do, since I'm on a Windows machine, is I'm going to press Alt and Backspace. If you're on a Mac, don't hold me to this, but I think it's Option plus Delete. So for me, on Windows, it's Alt plus Backspace, and I'll try it and see what happens here. Yep, there we go. And on a Mac, it's, I think, Option plus Delete. And what that has done is it's added a shadow in this shape, because this is selected, to this layer using this foreground color, okay, that we had previously selected. Okay, so now the next thing that we're going to do, I think at this point I can turn off my selection, because we've used the selection to create this shape for a fill. So next we're going to do is manipulate this to come out and look like these. So it has, the shadow for this vase has to stretch out this direction. With our shadow layer active, I'm going to come over to Edit, down to Transform, and I'm going to come down to Rotate. We get our magenta lines with the handles. And I'm going to, with my cursor position just a little outside of the handle, you should see a little two-headed arrow. And I'm going to start rotating this. And there's my shadow from my vase. How exciting is this? Okay. And you can see because the layer is below your object layer, the shadow layer it's going behind it, which is what we want it to do. Your shadow wouldn't come in front. So I'm just using that little handle outside, and what I'm trying to do is match the angle of this shadow to the angle of these shadows here, okay? And I'm going to make this a little smaller because it's a little distracting for me for it to be that big. There we go. And these are kind of angled, so I'm gonna do that. And you may have to just keep playing back and forth to get it the way you want, but that's just how it is in Photoshop. Now, there's also, you can see a certain amount of perspective going on here, so we do have to adjust the perspective of this shadow because it's gonna have to taper off heading this direction just like these shadows are. So again, come back to the Edit menu, down to Transform, and in that same area go to where it says Perspective and click on that. Okay, and because I want it to taper from this end, I'm going to position my cursor at this little corner handle here and push up a little. And can you see what it does with the perspective? It's adjusting the perspective there. And then I'm going to do the same thing here. So again, just keep playing with it until for your image you see. And now I'm just clicking and pulling it away because it's too far down. Okay. Now it's way too wide this way. So I want to go back to Edit, Transform, and now I'm going to Distort. Okay, so Distort will let me push it and pull it. So Perspective is going to angle your edges using those little white handles in the box to make things taper or go wider. Rotate will let you spin it around like how we spun around the shadow from behind the vase. And Distort will let you push and pull different things on the different handles. So this is too wide this way. So with Distort in play, I'm going to click on that little white handle and I'm going to pull this down, and I'm going to click on this little white handle and push things up because it's just out too far relative to where it would be. And then these are long shadows, so I'm going to pull from this middle. See how it's distorting it? Okay. And I'm also watching where the shadow is falling because you want it connected in where it would be a reasonable place relative to the bottom of your object. And it's a little hard for me to see it with this yellow highlighter there, but we're going to go with that like that. So I'm going to say that that's not bad there, and I'm going to click to accept that. It's also not bad from the perspective of, if we look closer again, well, I'm going to adjust it a little bit. So if you have, as I said, too hard-edged shadow that you create relative to the shadows in the scene, so you have to look at it's going to look fake. So these have kind of softer edges to them. So with the same layer active that we just created the shadow and rotated it, distorted it, and transformed it, we're going to also soften it a little bit so that it looks a little closer to these. So the way to do that is with this layer active, go up to Filter, come down to Blur, and go over to Gaussian Blur right there. Filter menu, down to Blur, and over to Gaussian Blur, and left click. And you'll get this little pop-up box. And this lets you adjust, I always leave it on preview so I can see what it's doing, how soft this is. And I don't want to go too soft because this is, now if you really want it super soft, you know, you can pull it all the way up. But see, and if you had much softer kinds of shadows, you can see what you can do with it. You can get it very soft if you want, but these aren't that soft. So I'm going to come back down and just soften it up to about that level there. Now I'm going to call it good enough and just stop because I don't want to spend too much time wasting time for you. You're not going to work on this image, so I just want you to show that you can use filter, blur, Gaussian blur if you need to adjust the hardness or the softness of the shadow that you've put down. Now, the other thing that we see is, it's a little bit weird, isn't it? That the shadow is out over this chair, which is in the foreground, so that's no good. So we're going to use the same principle of masking that I showed you before as a way to hide the vase. So with the same layer active, that's the shadow layer, in your layers panel, come down to the bottom of the layers panel to where you have the rectangle with the circle in it, which is to add a mask, a layer mask. And there we go. We've got our layer mask. We can see the mask is active because there's a white frame around it. We're going to use black because we want to completely mask out where this is overlapping onto the chair. And we're going to use the brush tool. It's at 100%. In this case, I don't want it smearing out. So I want a nice clean edge when I mask. So we're going to look at the type of brush, and to get a cleaner edge like that where it doesn't smear out softly, come down to where your hard brushes are, and I'm going to use a hard brush to mask off of the chair. And again, I'll just warn you right now, I'm not going to be too perfectionist about this because I just want to keep moving, and I realize this is a lot of steps. Okay, so then you just, with you're only painting on the mask, not on the image, because otherwise you can ruin your shadow. So this is just going to hide, and so you just paint to hide where the shadow is on any foreground elements. Right? So we're leaving it where it should be on the table and just taking it off the chair. Okay, we're painting, and if you overpaint and take out part you shouldn't, like let me say I just did that, you can use your X key to get white and put that back in there again, and then let you do a do-over. Alright, and take this off of the chair. And as I said, I'm not going to worry about being perfect about it, but just to give you the idea that any foreground elements, and I'll just put this there a little, oops, there we go. Alright, that's good enough for demo purposes to show you. And then if this is still a little bit too opaque, then we can also lower the opacity a little bit there. Okay, but it's pretty similar to the type of shadow that there is there. And there's some overlapping of shadows. So I'm going to leave that the way it is. The next thing I want to do, and again to help sell the realism, this still kind of looks, even with the shadow there, like it's just kind of floating there. So in order to make this look more realistic, you do need to put a contact point for the shadow too at the base of your image. And with shadows, you wouldn't just have a uniform effect like this. Normally there is, and you know, honestly I want to paint away some of this too. So I'm on the mask and I'm going to paint away some of this because this to me is just too far up. Okay. Alright, now we're going to be back on with the white frame around the image, then we're on there. Alright, and I'm going to put another layer above this one. So click on the new layer icon down at the bottom of the layers panel, the square with the plus, and this is going to be the contact shadow. And as I said, right around objects and in shadow, where there's shadows, there's usually a little darker closer to the object than further out. If you want to get more complex, you can also do things like using gradients to make these get softer and less colored at the time, but because this is more basic, I'm just going to leave this kind of a solid color shadow like this for now for purposes of the demo. Okay, and I'm going to make this shadow, this foreground color, we're going to click on the color picker, and I'm going to make it just a little bit darker just by clicking and moving it down a little bit. So I'm not going all the way to the black, I'm just staying in that same realm but a little bit darker. Okay, and then with a soft brush, so we're going back to the soft brush, we had used the hard brush to mask out the chair. Make sure you're on a soft brush. I'm going to lower the opacity again. I think I'll go back to around that 50-55% and a low flow that I can build up. So I'm going to go down to around 11-12%, maybe 10, but for now I'll just stay with wherever it is. Make your brush smaller. So see the circle in the center of my highlighter there? Make it smaller so it's not too far out. And what I'm going to do is just do a contact shadow just near the base of this. And I'm using a mouse right now, which is not the best thing, but if you have a tablet and work with a tablet, you can, so you can see I'm building it up here. And a sort of stylus, you can work a lot more accurately. All right, and it can come up onto the object a little bit. And just having that contact shadow helps sell the realism. You don't want it to be too obvious. But always when you're doing shadows, have a little bit darker closer to the object that's casting the shadow. And I'm not going to, again, spend too much time, but you can also look in books, or just sometimes what I'll do is I'll take just an object, whether it's a paperweight or something like that, and I'll shine a flashlight on it to get a sense for what the quality of the shadow is and where the shadow would fall and how it falls relative to the object. So you can look at things like that too. Okay, so now we have our contact shadow. So as I said earlier, in some composites you might need a reflection, but on a tablecloth we don't need a reflection here. So this is going to be pretty much what we're doing here for this, and those were my steps for creating a basic composite. And as I said, if you want to put in more than one object, you then have to follow those steps for each object that you're going to put in, and just keep adding them like I did to their own successive layers. Don't try to build the whole composite on a single layer, because if something goes south, then you have to start over again. So that was my composite in this case. I hope that's helpful. I will be creating other composite videos, as I mentioned, with regard to how to make a faux double exposure. I will be doing things for how to create reflections in composites in another video. I do have all the other tools for doing the selecting and masking and making tonal adjustments and color adjustments in some of my other videos. So if you want to check out my @Photomaker Academy channel, you can find that other educational content. And if you want to be alerted to future videos, because I do keep adding more content 1 to 2 times per month, subscribe below the video. On any of the videos, there's a subscribe button. You won't get any marketing or other emails from me. I don't do that. I'm doing this primarily for photo clubs. You'll just get a single alert directly from YouTube when I do post a new video 1 to 2 times per month. So thank you, and good luck with creating your own photorealistic composites.